How did a company that exploited its laborers to death while making Nazi military vehicles by the thousands go on to become one of the largest auto manufacturers in the world? The VW brand has certainly grown into a global automotive powerhouse, boasting such massive brands as Bentley, Lamborghini, Bugatti, and Porsche under the Volkswagen name. But back in World War II, they were among the darkest and most criminal of Germany's war factories, including allegations of design theft for their Beetle and using forced laborers for the majority of their workforce. It seemed like Volkswagen could get away with anything, and the fact that the company was founded by and the Nazis only added to its controversial history. But on the other hand, the company also serves as an incredible underdog success story. Once the Nazis were defeated and the company was left abandoned, it became an unwanted asset. Not even Ford wanted it when it was offered up for free. But even as bleak as things seemed for the company at the time, Volkswagen still managed to reinvent themselves and make one of the strongest comebacks in corporate history. So sit back and relax, because today we're covering the controversial story of Volkswagen, starting with an unlikely figure. The story of Volkswagen began in 1933 when a man named Adolf rose to the position of Chancellor in Germany. At the time, Germany was in a state of chaos, following their defeat in World War I and the subsequent Great Depression that swept across Europe. The German economy was in ruins. The country was facing high inflation and countless business closures, leaving millions of Germans unemployed and without an economic safety net. And of the 86 German car manufacturers that existed during the 1920s, only 12 survived. To confront this crisis, Hitler devised a new strategy to revive Germany's dying economy. And one of the key components of this new plan was to manufacture automobiles. You see, at the time, automobiles in Germany were still considered a luxury, as the few car manufacturers that remained still hadn't been able to mass produce affordable cars, due to a lack of capital and customers to sell to. Most Germans got around on public transport, bicycles, and motorbikes, as only 1 in every 50 Germans actually owned a car. As a great admirer of Henry Ford and his Model T, he dreamed of doing something similarly in his country. And thus, under a state-owned organization called the KDF, which stood for Strength Through Joy, he ordered the development of modern highways around Germany, known as autobahns, and developed an affordable car for its people. However, specifications for this vehicle seemed logistically unfeasible. You see, he demanded that the car needed to be small enough to carry a family of 5, fast enough to exceed 100 kilometers per hour, and cheap enough to cost less than 1,000 Reichmarks, which was about the cost of a small motorbike at the time. This automobile also needed to be very fuel efficient, using no more than 7 liters of fuel for every 100 kilometers, while at the same time having enough power in its engine to cruise smoothly along the autobahns. While this sounded good and ambitious, there was no German automaker that could match his specifications, with many even considering the feat impossible. That was until members of his political circle would introduce him to a man who coincidentally had been working on the same idea just a few years prior. In 1933, he was introduced to Ferdinand Porsche, a Czech engineer who had spent decades perfecting his craft, designing fast and high-performance vehicles for various car manufacturers, aiming to create race-worthy cars that could also be enjoyed by the general public. However, Ferdinand's passion extended to other pursuits. He was determined to create a simpler, more compact vehicle that would be accessible and dependable for the common man. For years, Porsche had pitched his idea to the companies he worked with, but none of them were willing to offer their support. Thus, using his own genius and taking inspirations from other engineers who'd been working on the same idea, he developed the Porsche Type 12 in 1931. The result was an incredibly lightweight vehicle with a rear engine and rear-wheel drive layout, with a curved body shape for better aerodynamics. While his prototype seemed promising, Porsche struggled to find financial backing for his project, and ultimately, only 3 prototypes were ever built. Luckily for him, upon their meeting, he was very pleased with Porsche's creation and was willing to work with him, especially because the vehicle matched some of his own design specifications. There was just one problem. Because Porsche came from Czech lineage, he was essentially considered subhuman in the eyes of the Nazis, as by then, they were already full steam ahead with their racial superiority propaganda. Thus, Porsche relinquished his nationality and swiftly obtained German citizenship in 1934 with the help of aides. Only then did they grant him the contract to design the KDF car. During the next few years, Porsche worked tirelessly in the back of his garage, struggling to develop the simple, inexpensive, air-cooled engine that was needed for the vehicle. In the end, he settled on a 4-cylinder layout with a capacity of under 1 liter for the motor, a format that was a perfect fit for a reliable, fuel-efficient automobile. By 1936, Porsche completed 3 prototypes for the People's Car, which included 2 sedans and a convertible. After running several tests, he was pleased with the results, and with this, he established the state-owned automobile company Volkswagen Werk, which translates to the People's Car Company, in 1937. The outcome of Porsche's prototypes would be the KDF Wagen, which stood for Strength Through Joy Car in Germany. This is the same car that would later be known as the Volkswagen Beetle. The vehicle was shown off by the Nazis at the Berlin Motor Show in 1938 and received great recognition from the public and car enthusiasts. However, some felt they'd already seen the car before. The truth is, Porsche did not come up with the structure of the Beetle entirely by himself. He actually used, or quite possibly stole, many ideas and designs from other engineers who had been working on the same concept. Consider, for example, the 1933 Standard Superior, a car designed by motor journalist Joseph Ganz, featuring a tubular chassis, a rear-mounted engine, and independent wheel suspension with swing axles. The very same features that would later end up in the Volkswagen Beetle, not to mention its signature domed roof design. Additionally, the Standard Superior was advertised as the German people's car, and even included the word Volkswagen in their ad campaign, years before the Volkswagen company was founded. Unfortunately, the production of the Standard Superior was shut down after only 2 years, and several members of their team were prosecuted by the Nazis for being Jewish, including Joseph Ganz himself, who was ousted from his position and even imprisoned. Although Joseph Ganz might have played a role in the early concept of the Beetle, the Nazis were able to use his Jewish status to eliminate him as any sort of credible threat in the auto industry, which is largely why he is not a more well-known figure today. Another example of Volkswagen's controversial design history can be found in the Czech auto company Tatra's V570 model, designed by Hans Ledvinka and Erich Jubilacker in 1931. Again, we find very similar features as those of the Beetle, with its rear engines and sleek curved design, as well as a 2-cylinder air-cooled engine. Was actually an admirer of Tatra's vehicles, and had actually remarked to Porsche, "This is the car for my roads." Ledvinka and Porsche would end up meeting regularly to discuss their designs from 1933 onwards. Porsche would later admit, "Well, sometimes I looked over his shoulder, and sometimes he looked over mine." Once the Beetle was completed, Tatra were so incensed by what Porsche had done that they threatened to take him to court for copyright infringement. Although Ferdinand was willing to settle, cancelled this, saying that he would take matters into his own hands. 15 months later, German tanks rolled into Czechoslovakia, invading and conquering their territory, including Tatra's factory. The Nazis then forced Tatra to stop producing the Type 97 in order to avoid comparisons with the Beetle, and shortly after, Tatra dropped their lawsuit. But if you want to go back even further, one of the earliest abstractions of what would later become the Beetle can be traced as far back as 1925, when at just 18 years old, Béla Barényi worked on a couple sketches for a chassis of a people's car, and coincidentally, all the key qualities are there: a backbone chassis design, transverse suspension springing, and a horizontally opposed air-cooled engine mounted just near the rear wheels, all of which would end up in Porsche's final design 13 years later. But the most shocking similarity of all is the fact that the design Barényi drew for the body of his car was, when compared, nearly identical to the Beetle's body design. The reality is, the Beetle wasn't just the design of one man. but instead the collective creative output of countless talented engineers all working at the top of their field. Both and Porsche knew this, but based on the events, it seemed like they turned a blind eye and tried to eliminate any sort of competition or threats of copyright infringement. But even though the Volkswagen project was backed by a dictator with seemingly inexhaustible resources, mass production was still a goal that seemed out of reach. In theory, the car was ready, but still needed more capital in order to fund the massive factory that he had in mind. Not only that, but also wanted to build a whole new city as well. Strangely, this city was to be called the City of Strength Through Joy, and was designed to represent his idea of a Nazi worker's paradise. He wanted it to become a great metropolis, just like Detroit had become in America, and set it up with the latest cutting-edge technology and production methods learned from Henry Ford. It was expected to produce 1.5 million cars annually by 1943, making it by far the largest automobile plant in Europe. To fund this project, he devised a savings scheme. The plan was that German citizens would make installment payments for their KDF wagon before receiving it by contributing 5 Reichmarks a week until reaching the car's total sum of 990 Reichmarks. That way, people could afford the car while he could apply those funds toward his city factory. For context, the German economy was still in rough shape, and the average income for a German worker at the time was 32 Reichmarks per week. So sacrificing 5 Reichmarks every 7 days could potentially create a strain for average working families. Regardless, his dicey plan served its purpose. Those who supported his regime gladly bought into the program, and eventually, around 336,000 people ended up participating in the 5 marks a week savings scheme. It's estimated that more than 280 million Reichmarks were donated in total, and it was this money that was used to help fund the Volkswagen factory city. Ultimately, however, the scheme was an utter failure for the German people. The factory that was expected to make 1.5 million vehicles annually only managed to produce a few hundred, and those hundreds were given to high-ranking Nazi officials instead. Those who put their money into this Nazi savings program never got to see the car they were promised, nor did they ever see their money again. The reason was, his factory was already busy producing something else. Although the initial idea of Volkswagen was to help mobilize the German people, there was another, more sinister plan behind it all along. One of the technical requirements for the Volkswagen car was that its bonnet had to be strong enough to support a machine gun. This secretly made the car functionally capable of becoming a military vehicle at any time. So in essence, rather than producing automobiles for the common man, Volkswagen were actually producing a fleet of war machines for the Nazis. In 1938, high-ranking SS officers approached Porsche to make a lightweight vehicle for the German army that could operate reliably in the most extreme conditions. Fortunately for Porsche, he didn't need to start from scratch. He simply based his design around the Beetle's components, and within a month, he had built the Volkswagen Kübelwagen. The Kübelwagen turned out to be very useful during his invasion of Poland, and after the Second World War broke out, Porsche developed 2 more military vehicles based around the Beetle: the Kommanderswagen, which were used by high-ranking Nazi army officers, and the Schwimmwagen, an amphibious 4-wheel drive vehicle that could drive on land as well as on and even under water. By 1940, the Volkswagen City plant had become an official war factory for the Nazis, halting the production of civilian vehicles entirely and accelerating the production of military vehicles and artillery. The factory, however, was severely understaffed, which significantly slowed their production progress. As a response, Volkswagen conscripted Soviet prisoners of war to work in their factories, as well as Polish civilian forced laborers, other migrant workers, and Jewish prisoners transferred from concentration camps. Among all these groups of forced laborers, regardless of their ethnicity, cultural, or religious background, one factor remained consistent: considered them subhuman. And so, under his rule, they lived accordingly. They were poorly housed, underfed, and labored for long hours under deplorable conditions, all while getting paid either very little or not at all, and frequently worked to death. A Polish forced laborer would later describe his feelings upon arriving at the city of the KDF wagon, saying, "I understood then that I am a slave. The first days in KDF City made me understand that I was an object that can work. With the number of forced workers increasing, Volkswagen took the disturbing step of building concentration camps right on the factory's grounds. Unfortunately, there was no gender segregation in their quarters, and this resulted in many of the women also getting pregnant during their confinement at the facility. At first, these pregnant women were simply sent back to their countries of origin, while the Jewish among them were sent back to the concentration camps they'd been sent from. But as the war escalated, these deportations became increasingly difficult to manage, so German officials established what they called a nursery facility. The idea was that it would be a place where pregnant workers could give birth and their babies could receive postnatal care. But the dark reality was that it functioned more like a death camp for the infants. The moment those babies were delivered into the facility, they were abandoned. Tragically, most of the infants succumbed to a combination of starvation, lack of medical care, and neglect. The mothers who came to visit their newborns would be shocked and heartbroken to find their babies covered in dozens of sores and bug bites, and sick from exposure to the cold weather due to the facility's cheap construction and insulation. The medical staff hired by Volkswagen also made little to no effort to care for the children, with the exception of one named Hilda Lammer, who protested the conditions and treatment of these infants to the facility's supervisor. Her objections, however, were ignored, and when she persisted, she faced threats of being sent to a concentration camp herself. Ultimately, it is estimated that no fewer than 365 infants and toddlers perished at the Volkswagen nursery facility, an establishment that only existed to get pregnant laborers back to their work sites as quickly as possible, unencumbered by their newborn children. During the war's peak, more than 80% of Volkswagen's workforce was composed of forced laborers, which by then had become the common practice for other German car manufacturers, such as Mercedes-Benz, Auto Union, and BMW. But interestingly enough, the vast majority of Nazi military vehicles weren't built in these factories, but rather in American-owned plants that were based in Germany, such as Ford and General Motors, who also employed forced laborers at their work sites. You see, prior to the war, Ford and GM were already integral players in the German economy, operating more than half of the country's car market from their subsidiaries. Therefore, when Nazi Germany decided to focus their attention solely on the war effort, these American auto companies also became a vital part of their military production. GM's plants in Germany, for example, built thousands of bombers and jet fighter propulsion systems for the Nazis, at the same time that its American plants produced aircraft engines for the US Army Air Corps. Ford, on the other hand, supplied more than half of the Reich's medium and heavy-duty trucks, as well as other war materials. So when the American troops successfully invaded France near the end of World War II, they were shocked to discover they shared something in common with their German enemies. Both sides were using vehicles built by Ford and General Motors. However, but while these companies profited from their work with the Third Reich, their German plants became major targets for aerial bombing, as well as Volkswagen's, whose production would often stop and start again as the factory workers feared they could be bombed at any time. Surprisingly, however, they weren't. This was because their site had been built so close to the war, the Allied forces didn't even know the factory existed until the war was nearly over. So while the rest of Germany's factories were pounded by Allied bombing, including Ford's and General Motors, Volkswagen had time to protect their technology and move most of their vital machinery to underground bunkers, until they were eventually detected in 1944 and Allied forces bombed the factory. By the time Germany was defeated and the war finally ended, Volkswagen's plant alone managed to produce more than 66,000 military vehicles for the Nazis. The place that was once called the City of Strength Through Joy had become a city of ruins, a mere shadow of its former self. And as for Volkswagen, it languished as a company without an owner, since its parent Nazi organization, the German Labor Front, no longer existed. Due to the evil nature of its use during the war, the Allied forces wanted to see Volkswagen destroyed entirely, just like other Nazi organizations. However, the Volkswagen brand is still very much around today, and they are bigger and stronger than ever. So this begs the question, what happened? After the war ended, the city of Strength Through Joy was renamed to Wolfsburg by the Americans, and its heavily bombed factory was handed over to the British Army. Ivan Hurst, a 28-year-old British officer, was assigned to eliminate the factory and discard, dismantle, or sell any existing parts of the production. But as Major Hurst began to sort through the chaos, he stumbled across a prototype of the KDF wagon and noticed that the production machinery was not too badly damaged. In fact, a lot of it was still workable. As an engineer himself, Hurst recognized the potential of the Volkswagen car and knew that it would be a waste to simply throw it all away. The people in the city were also desperate for jobs and affordable transportation, so it made sense to him for them to rebuild the factory and let the people benefit from it, rather than destroying it. But as it turned out, nobody else seemed to share his vision, especially given the factory's Nazi past. Ivan Hurst tried to give control of Volkswagen over to a British manufacturer, but they rejected the offer, stating that the vehicle did not meet the technical requirements of their cars, and that it was quite unattractive to the average buyer. They also deemed the commercial production of such a car to be unfeasible. So, Major Hurst considered a different approach. Recognizing that the British Army was in need of reliable transport, as most of their vehicles had been damaged in the war, he pieced together a KDF wagon, applied camouflage paint, and presented it to the British Army as a potential replacement for their military vehicles in Germany. The British Army liked the idea, primarily because of how reliable and affordable the vehicles were. As a result, they placed an order for 20,000 Beetles. Although Hurst had successfully managed to keep Volkswagen alive, he soon realized that his next big challenge was just beginning. As he began gathering workers from Wolfsburg, he quickly learned how deeply traumatized they were. The staff had been so conditioned to follow military orders that Hurst had to wear his own military uniform before any of the workers would even listen to him. He also found himself dealing with a starvation winter that swept through the country. Food was in constant short supply, and while hundreds of thousands of Germans died as a result, Major Hurst tried his best to take care of his own people within Wolfsburg. There was also a shortage of raw production materials, workable space in the factory, and engineers. Most of the engineers, designers, and supervisors were rounded up and arrested by the Allied forces due to their Nazi past, including Ferdinand Porsche. So Hurst ended up making several deals with the devil by lobbying for some of the imprisoned engineers to be released in order to work at the factories. All in all, Volkswagen slowly managed to roll out the vehicles, and despite being behind schedule, they were among the first German automakers to restart production after World War II. However, Hurst's commanders were still bent on getting rid of the factory because of what it stood for. They offered ownership of the factory to representatives from the American, Australian, French, and British motor industries, but all of them rejected it. By March of 1948, the British were desperate enough to get rid of the factory that they offered the company to Ford free of charge. Henry Ford II himself traveled to West Germany to inspect the facility, but upon arrival, his right-hand business partner advised him not to take it, saying, "Mr. Ford, what we're being offered here ain't worth a damn." And with that, they declined the offer. Since the British couldn't find anyone who wanted to manage the factory, they eventually decided that Volkswagen should simply manage itself, and would thus be handed back to the Germans. They appointed Heinrich Nordhoff, a German engineer who'd previously worked for BMW and Opel, to take control of the plant. When Nordhoff came in, he saw how messy and difficult the situation was with Volkswagen, but he also recognized their biggest and strongest asset, and that was where he set his focus. He doubled down on producing mainly one model, the Beetle, and kept its styling the same, while improving and upgrading the car's underpinnings over time. This approach made the company more efficient in their production, and Nordhoff wasted no time in exporting the Beetle outside of Germany in order to gain more revenue and bring in more valued currencies, starting with the European markets. Although the move was bold and risky, it eventually paid off. The German people were still struggling financially from the war, and the Beetle was just what they needed, thanks to its low price, fuel efficiency, and reliability. By the year 1950, a third of Volkswagen's car production consisted of exports, selling over 27,000 vehicles in 18 countries. While Volkswagen was becoming more promising throughout Europe and South America, the same couldn't be said for the US. Americans hated the Beetle. The simple compact size of the car couldn't compete with the big, powerful automobiles that were popular at the time. Not to mention, the very idea of the car reminded them of the Nazis, with some Americans even nicknaming the car Baby. Therefore, when the Beetle was first brought into America in 1949, only 2 cars were sold. Also, imported cars at the time were often seen as expensive and risky. Whenever these vehicles broke down or needed maintenance, their owners could have a difficult time finding the right mechanics or service stations around the country. And if they did find one, repairs were often expensive and lengthy, as the parts had to be ordered and shipped from abroad. But Heinrich Nordhoff understood those fears and decided to tackle these problems head-on. He set up a subsidiary in the United States called Volkswagen of America and began expanding dealerships and service stations as much as they could all across the country. This gave Americans a sense of security in Volkswagen, and as people began buying the Beetle, they realized it wasn't so bad after all. In fact, they liked it. Before long, the car became a symbol of the countercultural movement that was growing in the country. You see, during the 50s, America was riding a booming post-war economy, and people were buying bigger cars, bigger houses, and the latest luxury items. But there were also people growing up during this time who watched as their parents struggled trying to keep up with the Joneses. And these young people were growing tired of the excess, the superficiality, and the materialism. This new cultural movement was aimed more towards simplicity and freedom, and the Beetle represented exactly that. It was the ideal car for young people who just wanted something simple and reliable to drive, instead of a huge Chevy Impala. It was half the price, with more than twice the gas mileage of the average American car at the time. Before long, the company went from selling 6,000 Beetles in America in 1954 to over 100,000 Beetles by 1958. It's also worth noting that these growing sales were from word of mouth alone, as Volkswagen used virtually no advertising for their vehicles until 1959, when Nordhoff finally decided to run an ad campaign for the Beetle. While American car makers were advertising bigger, flashier cars suited for a lifestyle of mansions, mountains, and sex appeal, Volkswagen took the opposite approach. They marketed more towards the average worker who lived below their means and used humor to embrace the Beetle's unique appearance, all while demonstrating its efficiency and reliability compared to other cars of its time. They didn't overpromise as other car brands did, but instead, they showed their consumer base exactly what they were and were not capable of. This gave them the reputation as a company of rare honesty, and the people loved them for it. The Beetle quickly became an international sensation, selling millions of units during the 1960s, and eventually won the hearts of many around the world, including the reluctant Americans. Even Disney capitalized on Volkswagen's success, releasing their major box office smash, Herbie the Love Bug, which featured a VW Beetle with a mind of its own. This pushed the company's sales and popularity even further, while also clearing their image and completely breaking away from its Nazi origins. The demand for Beetles was so high that at one point, customers had to wait 12 to 18 months to receive their order. And by 1972, the car that supposedly wasn't worth a damn had overtaken Ford's Model T to become the best-selling car in the world after selling its 15 millionth, 7,034th unit. However, competition was catching up, and the Volkswagen company was about to be in serious trouble. While the Beetle was a major success for Volkswagen worldwide, the company wasn't growing or innovating enough to keep up with the American car market. The oil crisis of the 1970s made Americans switch to more fuel-efficient automobiles, and Japanese imports, such as Honda and Toyota, were better suited to accommodate their needs and comfort. They offered about the same price and efficiency as the Beetle, but had increased interior space and a more modern design. New emission standards also threatened the viability of Volkswagen's air-cooled engine. Meanwhile, safety concerns were also growing around the Beetle, as reports were showing fatality numbers were quite high in Beetle accidents. Due to these factors, as well as the growing competition in the US market, sales began to decline for Volkswagen, and they now found themselves in desperate need of a new design that would meet the emission standards, the fuel economy, and the safety challenges of the 1970s. In reality, the company had been working on new models to replace the Beetle since the early 60s, but the Beetle was selling so well for so long that they lost their urgency to do so, until suddenly, it was already too late. Many unfinished and discarded prototypes were made during this time, which led to the company's financial decline as sales began to plummet, and by the year 1977, the Beetle was no longer being sold in America, as it failed to meet the country's safety and emissions standards. Luckily, their acquisition of Audi in 1969 gave them a head start when it came to water-cooled engines and front-wheel drive technologies, which greatly helped expedite their development process and release a series of new models that met regulation standards, such as the Passat, Polo, and Golf during the mid-1970s. Although the company wasn't expecting to sell many of these models, the Golf, in particular, became an instant success in the market, especially in Europe. It had better performance and efficiency, as well as a sportier look than the Beetle, while still remaining a modest family vehicle. Eventually, it would go on to surpass the Beetle as one of the best-selling models in the world, selling over 35 million units as of today. By 1979, an improved Volkswagen sedan was introduced to the public, the Jetta, which would also become a major seller for the company through the decades. These successes allowed Volkswagen to recover from the Beetle's fall-off, and even helped the company acquire several other car brands over the years, such as Lamborghini, Bentley, Bugatti, Skoda, and Porsche, making them one of the largest auto manufacturers on the planet. However, while Volkswagen managed to grow its presence and influence around the world, things weren't looking so good for them in America. The honesty and trust that they had built with their customers was now about to change. After the Beetle's fall-off in the US, Volkswagen managed to stay relevant thanks to their Golf and Jetta sales. But with the rising competition for economy cars in the American market, they slowly started falling behind. Buyers simply had more options to choose from, and Japanese automobiles were becoming increasingly popular as they were much cheaper and had better fuel efficiency. By 1993, Volkswagen's US car sales had fallen to a meager 63,000, compared to the 574,000 sold in 1970. People were no longer taking Volkswagen seriously in America, and dealerships began closing down at a rapid rate all around the country. In response to this, the company decided to bring back the car that made them successful in the first place, and in 1998, a new version of the Beetle was released to the public. Unlike the original one, the new Beetle featured more modern comforts and technology, with front engine and front-wheel drive while still maintaining their trademark curved body design. By tapping into their client base's nostalgia for the classic Beetle, Americans rushed out to get a taste of this updated version, bringing the company waves of new clients, new sales, and recognition for their ability to reinvent themselves. The third generation of the Golf and Jetta also continued to perform well, and by the year 2000, around 350,000 Volkswagens were sold in the US, with 81,000 of those coming from the new Beetle alone. But the hype wouldn't last for long, and sales of the Beetle plummeted shortly after, and the company was back to dealing with its struggles. Even if the new Beetle succeeded long-term, it couldn't hide the fact that something wasn't right with Volkswagen. You see, the problem was that the company had long betted on small vehicles, and while this paid off during recessions and fuel crises, American buyers had switched towards larger vehicles over time, such as SUVs. Volkswagen was slow to identify this trend, and even after introducing their own SUVs, they were often judged as being too small and too expensive, with too expensive being one of the brand's major complaints. With the purchase of other luxury car brands, Volkswagen had included some of those premium technologies into their own vehicles, even in their lower-end models, and this naturally made them more expensive. While this was common for their European markets, Americans didn't want to pay premium prices for a brand that built its name and reputation selling affordable vehicles for common, working people. Since then, Volkswagen has, intentionally or otherwise, positioned itself as a near-luxury car brand in the eyes of many Americans. For a while, the only thing that made the company stand out from the others was their economical, clean diesel offerings, which made sense at a time when gasoline prices were setting record highs in 2008, leading Volkswagen to receive the Green Car of the Year award in 2009. According to Volkswagen at the time, their new vehicles could run clean diesel engines while still performing smoothly and delivering fuel efficiency, and all by utilizing a revolutionary technology that other car makers just couldn't make work. But the truth was, Volkswagen's engine exhausts were more than 40 times dirtier than what the company claimed them to be. In 2015, Volkswagen was caught cheating in their diesel emissions test by installing a deceitful software designed to manipulate the measurements of their car's pollution since 2009. The results turned out to be highly illegal since it greatly failed to meet the emissions standards in the US, costing the company a whopping $30 billion in fines and settlements. But perhaps most damaging of all, this scandal lost Volkswagen the decades-long trust they'd built with their customers. The honest car company that everyone once loved and cherished had become a tarnished brand that openly lied about the cars they sold simply out of greed for greater profits. But even with this reputation, the Volkswagen Group has maintained their strong global sales despite their struggles in the US. And by 2016, it overthrew Toyota to become the largest auto manufacturer in the world, a title that has volleyed back and forth between the two auto giants ever since. In modern times, Volkswagen has developed more competitive SUVs for the American market, such as the Atlas and the larger Tiguan, and has now leaned aggressively into the electrification of their vehicles in the hopes of distancing themselves from their diesel scandal and to retain their lead in the auto market. But as we wait and see, one thing is certain: they sure have come a long way from being a Nazi car company. Thank you guys for watching. Hope you enjoyed the video, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Until then,